No duke would cross a ballroom for you, Lady Marguerite Vance murmured into her fan, loud enough for the three closest matrons to hear, and clear enough to carry to the chandelier. Her smile had the polish of new silver and the temperature of melted snow. She did not look at Iris when she said it. She looked at the orchestra, as though offering the orchestra private confidence. The fan moved once, twice, and the dancers between them rearranged into a long lane of silk and candlelight. Across that lane, a man set down his glass on a passing tray, stepped between two countesses without apologizing, and crossed the entire length of the ballroom in 8 unhurried strides. He stopped in front of Iris, inclined his head precisely once, and said, "I believe this set is mine." Iris had not asked anyone for a set. Iris did not know him. She counted, very quickly, the way she always counted before she spoke. 2 breaths. 3. The orchestra had begun the opening figure of a country dance she could perform in her sleep. The matrons within Marguerite's hearing had already turned their heads. The chandelier above them shed 40 candles' worth of yellow light and cast it down across his shoulders, and his shoulders were broad enough to take it. He waited. He did not look at Marguerite. He did not look at the orchestra. He looked at Iris, and his eyes were the color of weak tea held up to a window, and there was no triumph in them, no claim, no theatre. There was only a steady, patient attention, as if he had already been looking at her for a long time, and had merely chosen this moment to be visible while he did it. "It is yours," she said. He offered his hand. His glove was plain, uncreased. He had not been on the floor that night. She placed her fingers across his, and he closed his around them once, lightly, as though confirming a fact, and led her into the line of dancers. Behind her, she heard Lady Marguerite's fan stop. The music began. The figure was the new spring set, with its turn and its slow promenade, and the flutes were doing the thing the flutes always did at Lady Halford's ball, a half-beat slow, indulgent, the way a pretty woman talks. He took her through the first turn. His hand at her waist was firm and exact. He knew the placement of every finger. He was a man who had been taught dancing the way some men were taught fencing, not for pleasure, for precision. "You will not insult me," he said quietly, between figures, "by pretending we have met." Her chin lifted half an inch. "I had not yet decided how to insult you. Give me a moment." The corner of his mouth turned up. He did not laugh. He guided her through the cross-step and took her hand again on the return, and she counted again, because counting was what she did when she could not yet choose. 1, 2, 3. The pad of his thumb pressed once, briefly, across her knuckle. It was not a caress. It was a steadying. The gesture of a man who had laid a hand on a horse before mounting. "You crossed the room," she said, low, under the figure. "I did." "Why?" "Because the alternative was unbearable to me." He turned her, and the candles caught the smell of garden mud rising from the open windows, the smell of rain on stone, and the first deep green of spring. "And because you are still wearing the indigo, I remember." The figure ended. He bowed. She curtsied. He gave her hand back to her with a precision that made the giving back feel like the gift, and then he stepped to the side and waited for her to turn away from him, because that was a gentleman's obligation. She turned. She walked through the lane of dancers with her chin in its assigned position and her count steady, and only when she had reached her sister's elbow on the far wall did she let out one breath that no one heard. Her hand, when she set it against the cool silk of her own skirt, was warm. Her pulse, under the indigo at her wrist, ran slightly fast. The smell of beeswax candles and the warm bodies of dancers and a faint thread of someone's bergamot cologne hung in the air. The sound of the orchestra came through it like rain on a stone roof. She felt her own breath move once, twice, against the soft warmth of the high bodice. She brought the count down. "Iris," whispered Beatrice. "Iris, who was that?" "I do not know." "You do not know? You danced with him. You did the spring set. He crossed the entire room, Iris. He crossed the entire room. Marguerite Vance is going to have a small private fit in the supper room. Iris, who was that? I do not know, Iris said again, evenly, and the calm in her voice was the same calm she used to set a fractious horse, because the fact of not knowing him was, as Marguerite had so generously announced, a public condition now, and one she would have to manage. Across the room, the man who had crossed it was speaking to Lord Halford, and Lord Halford was nodding, and Lord Halford was, Iris noted, because she always noted, bowing the precise inch deeper that men of Halford's seniority bowed only to dukes. Beatrice, she said softly, find out. Beatrice was 19, and had the social intelligence of a tax assessor and the manners of an enthusiastic spaniel. The spaniel comparison was direct, since Beatrice had brought one to London, and it was at this moment chewing a glove somewhere in the Halford anteroom. Beatrice, for once, did not require instruction. She was already gone. Iris stayed against the painted wall and let the ball move around her and counted, methodically, the things she now needed to know. Who he was, why he had crossed, what he meant by the indigo I remember, where she might have worn indigo before in his presence, and when. She was 26 years old. She had been out for 7 seasons. She had been told no for 2 of them, quietly, deniably, in the language of half-promised carriages and gentlemen who suddenly remembered other engagements, ever since her father's quarrel with the Vance interest had moved the Vances to the unkind hobby of shaping her reputation. She had developed, over those 2 years, a particular skill, the skill of looking exactly as composed as she felt, which was very, and exactly as injured as she chose to be, which was never. Marguerite Vance had not invented, "No duke would cross a ballroom for you." Marguerite Vance had been quoting her cousin Edmund, who had been saying it in clubs since Christmas. A man had now crossed a ballroom for her. She did not know him. She was going to find out. Beatrice came back 10 minutes later, with her cheeks pink, and Mustard the spaniel in her arms, Mustard being smuggled out of the anteroom with the remains of someone else's kid glove dangling from his small, wet jaw, and a piece of intelligence so useful that Iris almost forgave the spaniel. "Halloway," Beatrice whispered. "What?" "The Duke of Halloway. He is the Duke of Halloway. He has been in the country since November. He came up to town only yesterday, and Lord Halford says he was very particular about being invited tonight. Iris, he asked Halford specifically if you would be here." The Duke of Halloway. Iris's count missed a beat, which it almost never did. Halloway was a name attached, in her recollection, to a boy of 19 who had been sent abroad after his father was lost at sea, and to a young man of 24 whose engagement to a Miss Vance, yes, that Vance, that family, had been the talk of the previous winter, and had quietly broken in February for reasons no one had explained. Halloway was a duchy in the west, 3 days' hard riding from London, with the border marches between, and the border marches were not anywhere a man crossed without reason. If the new Duke had ridden up from Halloway, across the marches, to London, in 2 days, in spring weather, through the rivers in thaw. She set Mustard's small, wet nose firmly away from her hem. "Beatrice." "Yes?" "I have not worn indigo to a London ball in my life. I have not worn indigo anywhere this season. The last indigo gown I owned I wore in Vienna 2 springs ago, the week we were at the embassy, and Father took us through the Volksgarten because the cherry trees were out." Beatrice's face cleared like a window. "Oh," she said. "Oh." "Yes," said Iris. "Iris?" said Beatrice, with the rapt horror of a small girl watching a very good play. "Did he meet you in Vienna?" "I do not remember meeting him." "Then he was watching you." Iris said nothing. She set her count. She walked, very calmly, with her sister and the spaniel and the half-eaten glove, the length of Lady Halford's ballroom, and out into the supper-room, and she did not look at Lady Marguerite Vance once. And Lady Marguerite Vance, this Iris saw from the corner of her eye, looked at her 3 separate times in the space of those 40 paces, and on the third look, Marguerite's fan opened too quickly, and her hand was not entirely steady. The Duke of Holloway, across the room, was speaking with two ambassadors and was not looking at Iris at all. He had crossed once. He would not cross twice in one evening. He was, Iris understood, with a small, stunned warmth in the base of her throat. A man who knew the difference between a crossing and a campaign. She had been told, all winter, that no man would cross. A man had now crossed. She did not yet know what to do with the warmth in her throat. She put it, for the moment, where she put everything she did not yet know what to do with. She put it under the count. The card arrived at Corendon House the next morning, before the breakfast tray. It was not on a silver salver, because Hodgson, the Corendon butler, had been butler to 2 earls and 1 viscountess, and knew exactly which calling cards required the salver, and which required the deferential personal delivery. He had brought it himself, on his own gloved palm, at 20 minutes past 9, and had stood beside the breakfast room door in an attitude that was, Iris noted, because she was still noting everything, the attitude of a man who had not quite decided whether to be pleased. "Holloway," said her father, peering across at the card. The Earl of Corendon was 62 years old, narrow in the face, and had a grey-shot beard in the new short fashion. He had not yet had his coffee, which made him plain. "Holloway. Very particular for 9 in the morning." "He arrived at our doorstep, my lord, 15 minutes ago," Hodgson said. "On foot, without a carriage. He has gone away again. He left the card and his compliments, and the remark that he would call this afternoon, if convenient, at the conventional hour." "On foot," said the Earl. "On foot, my lord." "From his hotel?" "Apparently, my lord." "In his evening boots?" "Apparently, my lord." The Earl looked at his elder daughter over the rim of his coffee cup, which had now, with appalling timing, been delivered. "Iris." "Yes, father." "You danced one set with the Duke of Holloway last night." "I did." The set in question was the spring set. "It was." "Did you, at any prior time, exchange so much as a calling card with this man?" "No." The Earl set down his coffee. He looked at Beatrice, who was, to her great credit, eating toast as though she had no opinions. He looked at Iris. He picked the card up from Hodgson's palm and turned it over, and his thumb moved across the engraving with the grave attention of a man reading a treaty. Then he set it down and said, with a calm Iris recognized as the calm of a man working on a problem in his head, "Beatrice." "Father." "Take the spaniel out of the breakfast room." "Father, he is asleep. He is not even—" "Take the spaniel." Beatrice went. The door closed behind her with the ostentatious gentleness of a girl who would be listening at the keyhole within the half-minute. Mustard, before he disappeared, made a small editorial sound around the corner of the rug. "Iris," said the Earl quietly, "have you the slightest notion why the Duke of Holloway crossed Lady Hufford's ballroom last night to claim a set he had not asked for?" "I have a theory." "Will you share it?" She breathed once, twice, 3 times. "Vienna, father. 2 springs ago. The week of the embassy reception. There was a young Englishman in the Volksgarten when we walked there. He spoke to me about the cherry blossom. I did not catch his name. He was on his way back to England. He had just come into something. He was newly arrived in his title. He was very quiet about it. He asked me a question about the trees. I gave him the flower from a branch. I did not know him." The Earl did not blink. "And you wore indigo?" "I wore indigo." He sat in silence for a long minute. Then he said, mildly, "He has carried that 2 years." "Father, we cannot." "He rode here from Holloway, Iris. From Holloway. Through the marches in March. He came to the ball within 26 hours of arriving in town. He left his card on foot at 9 in the morning. I am 62 years old. I know what that costs a man. And I know what it means." "His engagement was to a Vance," Iris said quietly. "The Vance interest is presently devoted to my reputation." "His engagement was broken in February." "By whom?" The Earl looked at her over his cup. If we are very lucky, Iris, by the lady. If we are unlucky, by him. I shall make discreet inquiries before this afternoon. You will receive him. You will be what you always are. Composed. Composed. Father. She set her hands one over the other on the cloth, very precisely, and counted them as if they belonged to someone else. He said, last night, he said he came because the alternative was unbearable to him. That is a great deal to say to a woman in a country dance. The Earl regarded her with a long, complicated look that contained, in approximately equal parts, paternal concern, social calculation, and the small private pride of a man whose daughter had just been told something true at a ball. Yes, Iris, he said. It is. He came at 3. He came in a riding coat, not a morning coat, saffron-lined, dust still at the cuff from the road north of Holborn, and he had not changed his boots either. The boots were country boots, worn in, the leather creased at the ankle from gripping a horse. He bowed precisely 1 inch deeper than rank required when he greeted her father, and exactly the correct inch when he greeted Iris, which she noted, because precision was a language she read fluently. He sat in the green chair. He accepted tea. He held the cup as a man holds a cup he is using to occupy his hands. Clarendon, he said, I shall not waste your afternoon. I have come to ask your daughter's permission to call upon her. Plainly stated, sir. It was meant to be. Alloway, you have been in town 28 hours. I have been in love rather longer. The Earl did not move. Iris's hand on her saucer did not move. Beatrice, in the corner, made a small sound which she immediately disguised as a cough. Mustard, who had been forbidden the room and had achieved it anyway, decided this was the moment to lay his small, spotted body across the Duke's left boot. The Duke looked down. He looked up at Iris. I beg your pardon, he said gravely. I appear to be claimed. He does that, said Beatrice. He has opinions about boots. Excellent opinions by the look. He did not move his foot. He bent his head once, courteously, to the spaniel, and the spaniel sighed and went to sleep. The Duke, with his boot now occupied, returned his attention to Iris's father. Sir, he said, I shall not deceive your daughter in the smallest particular. I met her 2 springs ago in Vienna. I asked her about the cherry trees in the Volksgarten. She gave me a flower. I have carried it. I came into my title the week before. I was travelling home through the courts at the express request of my mother, and I was not, at that time, at liberty to speak. I had been engaged to Lady Adela Vance since I was 19, by the wills of our parents, and Lady Adela had, wisely and kindly, declined to allow that engagement to bind her any longer. She broke it on the 18th of February of this year. I received the letter on the 22nd. I made arrangements for my estate. I rode for London the moment the rivers were open. Alloway, said the Earl, you understand what is being said about my daughter in your acquaintance? I do. By a Vance. By a Vance who is not Lady Adela. Lady Adela has, I might say, expressed her opinion of her cousin Edmund's amusements to me in writing. She enclosed it, in fact, with the letter dissolving our engagement. She is presently in Lyon. Alloway, said the Earl, more quietly. Why on foot at 9 this morning? The Duke was silent for the first time. He looked at Iris. The cup did not tremble in his hand, but for one instant his thumb pressed the rim with a force that paled the pad. Because I had not slept, sir, and the streets were empty, and I did not yet trust myself with horses. Iris, said the Earl. Yes, father. Will you receive his grace? She set her cup down. 3 fingers, 2 breaths. She lifted her eyes to the man across the room, to his patient, slightly defeated mouth, and the dust on his cuff, and the dog on his boot, and the small frown at the corner of his eye that said he had not slept and had ridden 3 duchies in 5 days, and had crossed a ballroom for a woman he had not been allowed to address for 2 years. And she thought, very precisely, I am Lady Iris Carrington, and I do not commit myself before I understand a man. I shall receive him, she said, in the gardens at Vauxhall on Thursday, with my sister and the dog. The Duke inclined his head as gravely as if she had granted him an audience. I shall be honoured. Halloway, said the Earl, one further point, while we are speaking plainly. Sir, the Vance interest will not be pleased with you. The Vance interest, sir, has not been pleased with me since I declined to marry into it. I find I do not require its pleasure. He set down the cup. He bowed. He extracted his foot from beneath the spaniel, with the ginger care of a man diffusing a small bomb, and Mustard sighed again, betrayed. He took his leave with the precise inch of bow her father's rank required, and the additional inch he had not given before, to Iris. When the door closed, Beatrice said, quite reverently, He is very polite to dogs. Yes, said Iris. He looked at you, said Beatrice, as though you were a window he had been looking at from outside in the cold. Beatrice, I am only saying. Iris sat very still and counted, because she could not yet think. And the count was the thing she did instead of thinking, until thinking was safe. Vauxhall Gardens, on Thursday afternoon, smelled of rain on garden mud and the white blossom of the hawthorns along the back walk, and the river at the southern end was running dark and full with the thaw. The pleasure boats were up for the season. The orchestra in the rotunda was rehearsing a new piece, badly. Iris and Beatrice and Mustard came in by the eastern gate at 4. Halloway met them by the chinoiserie pavilion, and precisely 5 minutes passed, and bowed and offered Iris his arm, and said only, Will you walk? She took the arm. They walked. Beatrice followed at a distance, carefully calibrated to permit private conversation, while preserving every reputation in the case. The spaniel followed Beatrice. The spaniel had already eaten part of someone's discarded handbill and was pleased with himself. Halloway walked with the contained, slightly shortened stride of a man adjusting his pace to a smaller person without making the adjustment visible. He did not speak for the first 100 yards. The hawthorn smelled of wet sugar. You are wondering, he said at last, what to ask me first. I am wondering, she said, whether I should pretend not to. Please do not. Very well. She did not look up at him. She watched the path. How long were you in Vienna? 11 days. And of those 11, how many did you spend in the Volksgarten? A small breath of laughter, almost soundless. All of them, from the second day onward. Why? Because I saw you there on the second day, and I established that you walked at the same hour each morning. And I did not, at that time, have any honourable means of being introduced to you, since my mother's letter, bidding me return at once, had arrived the same morning, and I had a duty I had not yet broken to a woman I respected. And I therefore decided I would at least allow myself to walk where you walked, at the hour you walked, until I had to leave. For 9 days. For 9 days. And we spoke once, on the 8th, about the cherry trees. You said something, I shall not flatter myself by repeating it, and gave me a single blossom from a low branch you broke yourself. You said it would dry well between paper. I left for England the following morning. And you did not write. I had nothing I might honourably write to you. She considered this. The path turned. The hawthorn ended. An avenue of new chestnuts began. And in February, he said quietly, I received Lady Adela's letter. I did not, I confess, open it for 1 full day. I had, by then, taught myself a kind of contented resignation. I had not realized how thoroughly until the letter undid it in a quarter of an hour. I made my arrangements. I rode. From Halloway, through the border marches. The bridges were uncertain, and one of them was out at Marlow. I went round by Henley. I came into London on Tuesday evening. I called on Halford. I asked the question. I attended the ball. You were the third person I saw on entering the room. And you wore indigo. And you were being addressed across a fan. By Lady Marguerite Vance. Yes. Why did you cross? He stopped walking. The path was narrow, and the hawthorn at this point still ran along the right. The rain that had fallen the night before had silvered the leaves. He did not turn his face fully toward her. He looked, instead, slightly past her shoulder, at the dim shape of Beatrice and the spaniel coming 20 yards behind. Because, he said, she said no duke would cross a ballroom for you. And it was the simplest correction of fact I have ever offered in my life. She did not laugh. She was not, at that moment, capable of laughing. But she did, for the first time, allow herself a smile he could see. It was a small smile. It went only as far as the corner of her mouth and stopped there. He saw it. He registered it as a man registers, on a cold ride, the precise moment at which the road begins to climb. He drew her arm a fraction more securely through his. They walked. Beatrice followed. The river was loud at the southern end, and the boatmen were calling. Mustard barked at a swan and was towed into the position of dignified embarrassment that Beatrice had learned to apply with the lead. Halloway. My name is Theodore. Theo, if you can bear it. Halloway, she said again, deliberately, because she would not yet give him Theo, and he understood her perfectly, and did not protest. I shall accept your courtship on 3 conditions. Name them. First, you will not pretend the Vance interest is not the Vance interest. Edmund has been telling London since Christmas that no man would cross a ballroom for me, and now you have, and he will not bear it gracefully. I shall require honesty from you in the exact degree to which we are about to be the subject of unpleasantness. Granted, without qualification. Second, you will not flatter me. I have been flattered by very poor men for 2 seasons, and have learned to dislike it. Madam, I shall make every effort. Third, she lifted her chin a precise 1/4 inch and looked, for the first time, directly into his face. You will tell me the next time you decide something on my behalf without consulting me before you decide it, not after. He inhaled once. The line of his jaw moved. That, he said, I had not anticipated. I assumed not. It is the correct condition, granted. Good. She walked on. He kept her arm. The chestnuts thinned. Across the lawn, Beatrice was attempting to remove a piece of garden refuse from Mustard's mouth, and the spaniel was performing the entire repertoire of a small dog being asked to surrender something it had decided was its own. Now, you will tell me the name of every member of your household I shall be obliged to know, beginning with your housekeeper, who will be most important. He looked down at her. His mouth, very slowly, took on the patient curve it had taken on at the end of the first dance. Mrs. Greaves, he said. She rules unopposed. She has views. She likes dogs. Mustard will be delighted. He will not be the first. They walked a slow half-circuit of the garden. The hawthorn took them again, and let them go. By the time they returned to the eastern gate, the orchestra had stopped rehearsing, and the new green of the chestnuts had begun to show against a sky the colour of pearl. And Iris's count had, for the first time since Lady Marguerite's fan had moved at the chandelier, gone unattended, because she had been listening to a man tell her, with the small, precise pleasure of a man finally permitted to speak, what his housekeeper liked for breakfast. 3 days later he came to Clarendon House at 4. The library at Clarendon had been Iris's room since she was 16, the Eastern Library, the one with the tall windows over the small garden, the one in which her father had given up trying to enforce silence. There was a long table at one end where she kept her work. The work, on this afternoon, was a botanical map of the Clarendon home wood, half finished, with the eastern coppice still in pencil. She had been mapping it in coloured ink in her own time for 3 years. The map was not for any commission. The map was for the satisfaction of having mapped it. She did not put the map away when Hodgson announced him. She let him be brought into the library where she was working, because the third condition of her courtship had been a condition of nothing to be pretended about, and pretending to be a woman who did not draw maps would have been a small lie that grew. He paused in the doorway. He looked at the table. He looked at the map. He came forward at the careful pace of a man entering a room of museum glass, and stopped 2 paces from the table, and looked, and did not speak, and looked some more. "This is the Corendon coppice," he said at last. "Yes." "You have been at it for some time." 3 years. "You have not had it engraved." "It is not for engraving." He absorbed this. He looked across the map at the small ivory dish in which she kept her pencils, and then at the glass paperweight, and then at her hands, and then at her face. "Iris," he said, "you drew the map of the Vienna Volksgarten that the embassy printed in 24. She put down her pen. "It was unsigned," he said. "My mother sent it to me on my birthday that year. She said it was the best botanical key she had ever seen, and she would not tell me who had drawn it. I can see the same hand. It was printed without my name at my own request. Why? Because if I had signed it, the embassy would not have printed it. Because the embassy commissioned a Mr. Fellows of Highgate, who was paid, and who did not produce. And a friend of my father's quietly suggested I make one over to fulfill the contract on Mr. Fellows' behalf. Mr. Fellows was therefore credited. He had a wife. He had needs. I had the use of the Volksgarten gardener for 9 days. It was a fair exchange. You drew the... Yes. In Vienna? Yes. In the spring, you were 18? Yes. While you were walking in the gardens for 9 days for reasons I now understand." He set his hand, very flat, on the corner of the long table. He looked at the map. He looked again at her. "Iris," he said, "I have been carrying that map in my study for 2 years." "I know," she said, and she was, to her own astonishment, smiling outright. "I saw the Halford Botanical Society's reprint last summer at the Royal Institution. They sent me an off-print. Through Mr. Fellows." Mr. Fellows is an excellent old man with a very useful name." He did not laugh. He did not, for the moment, do anything. He only stood with his hand on the table, looking at her. And the look on his face was the look of a man who had been told that the impossible thing he had been carrying was, in fact, also being carried, quietly, equivalently, on the other side of an invisible room. Beatrice came in at this point with Mustard on a lead, because Beatrice had been instructed by their mother to chaperone, and Beatrice had a very clear sense of duty. She took one look at the 2 of them, decided the room had a temperature she could not yet name but recognized she should not interrupt, and folded herself with theatrical economy onto the window seat. Mustard, less tactful, made directly for the Duke. Halloway, without taking his eyes from the map, reached down and laid the flat of his hand on the spaniel's head and held it there. Mustard, briefly, swooned. "You came in to ask me something," she said. "I came in," he said carefully, "to ask you whether I might commission you to map the Halloway home wood. That is the question I came in to ask. It is not the question I am now asking." "What is the question now?" "Whether you would mind very much if I told my housekeeper, this evening, to keep 3 rooms ready for a possible eventuality at her earliest convenience." She set down the second pen. "Halloway?" "Yes." 3 conditions. Granted and granted and granted, and I will not, decide a single thing on your behalf without consulting you, including the rooms. The housekeeper, however, requires advance notice of possible eventualities. It is her religion. I do not know what to do but tell her there is a possibility." "Is there?" "Lady Iris," he said, very quietly, "there has not been anything but a possibility for 2 springs." She found, when she next attempted speech, that the Count had failed her, and she therefore did not speak. And she chose instead to stand up from her chair at the long table, and to walk, with the absurd care of a woman crossing a frozen pond, around the corner of the table, and to stop, exactly, 3 feet from him. Mustard, between them, looked up with the air of a small judge. Beatrice, on the window seat, had, with great discretion, become entirely engaged in the contemplation of the small garden through the eastern window. "You will tell your housekeeper," Iris said, "that there is a possibility." "I will. And you will not, in the next 2 months, attempt to advance that possibility through any means other than the ones I name." "I will not." "And you will continue," she said, "to come and look at my map." "Lady Iris," he said, "I shall be unable to do otherwise." He left the library a quarter of an hour later. The library smelled, after he had gone, very faintly of the country, of saddle leather, of road dust, of the cold, sharp green of new hawthorn. And Beatrice, on the window seat, turned at last and said, "Iris, he was going to weep on your map." "He was not." "He was. He did the men's not weeping thing they do, with the throat." "Beatrice, take Mustard out." "Yes, but Iris, Beatrice." "He carried your map," Beatrice said, "for 2 years. Iris, this is a very good story. I should like to be in it." "You are in it." "Yes, but I should like to be importantly in it." "You will be," Iris said, looking down at the long table and the unfinished coppice and the small ivory dish, and the Count beginning, again, in the back of her mind. "Beatrice, very importantly, very soon, because the Vance cousins are not going to like any of this at all." The bookbinder's was on Crown Street, and had been Mr. Linwood's establishment for 30 years. Iris had been a customer since she was 17, and brought her own paper. She had a standing order for a heavy buckram, in the deep green her father had taught her was the right green for a country house's books, and she came in once a fortnight to collect what was finished, and to bring what was new. She did not bring company on these errands. The bookbinder's was hers. He was there. He was leaning over Mr. Linwood's counter, examining a sample of half-calf with the absorbed attention of a man who was perfectly capable of choosing his own bindings, and Mr. Linwood was speaking to him in the slightly elevated tone Mr. Linwood used to gentlemen who knew exactly what they wanted, but enjoyed pretending they were taking advice. Halloway looked up as the bell rang above her head. He did not move. He inclined his head 1 inch. "Lady Iris." "Halloway." "This is unrelated to our previous conditions. I came in for marbled end papers. Mr. Linwood is most knowledgeable on the question of marbled end papers." "Mr. Linwood is most knowledgeable on the question of every paper that has ever been made." "I am beginning to perceive." Mr. Linwood, the bookbinder, who had been a craftsman for 30 years and a quiet observer of the gentry for almost as long, met Iris's eye over the Duke's shoulder and produced, for an instant, the precise expression of a man who had been, all his life, a connoisseur of marbled end papers, watching 2 of his finest customers select one another. Then he became professional again and stepped backward, with the smallest of bows, into his back room. "You came," she said, low, "for marbled end papers." "I did. I have an album that requires rebinding. I've been putting it off for a year. I find I no longer wish to put it off." "What album?" He did not answer at once. He turned the sample of half-calf over in his hand. He set it down. He produced from his coat pocket, and she watched it because she watched everything, a small dark green pocketbook of the kind gentlemen carried for memoranda, and he opened it, and he turned, with a precision of touch that suggested he had made the same motion many times, to a particular page, and he laid it on the counter and turned it, very slightly, toward her. Pressed against the center of the page, between 2 leaves of tissue, was a single dried cherry blossom. It was almost colorless now. It was very, very flat. The stem was tied with a faint thread of brown ribbon. She looked at it. She did not speak. He closed the pocketbook. He returned it to the inner pocket. He gave her, across the counter of the bookbinder's, the same 1-inch inclination of his head he had given her in the doorway of her library. And she understood, with a small, precise warmth at the base of her throat, that he had not come to the bookbinder's by accident, that he had come because she came on Thursdays at 4, and that he had brought the pocketbook with him because he wanted her to see it, without saying he wanted her to see it. "Holloway," she said, quietly, "you did not come for end papers." "Lady Iris," he said, equally quietly, "I came for end papers, and I came to walk you home. And I came because I find I am happiest in rooms where you have just been. Mr. Linwood will produce you your buckram and his best advice on a marble. I shall wait by the door. If, when you have your business done, you would care to walk through Hyde Park, I shall be pleased to walk through Hyde Park. If you would care to go directly home, I shall be pleased to walk you home. If you would prefer that I walk on the other side of the street, I shall walk on the other side of the street. Holloway, Lady Iris, you will walk on this side of the street." "Madam, gladly." She closed the pocketbook in her own mind, as she had seen him close it on the counter, and felt, under her glove, where her own pulse ran in her wrist, a small, sharp, warm pressure that she did not yet name. The shop smelled of leather and beeswax, and the slow, dry sweetness of old paper. Mr. Linwood's brass bell, when she opened the inner door to the back room, rang twice. The brass was cool against the soft skin of her thumb. She gave Mr. Linwood her order in the calm voice she used for all her orders, and Mr. Linwood, in the calm voice he used for all his customers, took it. When she came out with her parcel 10 minutes later, he was on her side of the street. He took the parcel. He did not offer his arm. He had already learned that, in the streets, she preferred to go with her hands free. He walked at her side the whole length of Crown Street and across into the park, and they went, by some unspoken agreement, the long way, by the Serpentine. And he did not speak for the first 5 minutes, and she did not speak either, because she was, at that moment, counting again. But the count had a different rhythm now. It had ceased to be tactical. It had become, more or less, the metronome of her happiness, and she was unfamiliar with that, and she counted it the way one counts a new pulse. "Tell me," she said, somewhere along the water, "about Lady Adela." "What would you have me tell you?" "Whatever you can tell me without dishonor." He thought about this for a moment. He stepped around a puddle. He stepped her around a puddle, with a small adjustment of his hand at her elbow that did not quite touch her elbow. "Adela is a woman of considerable intelligence and very firm opinions," he said. "We were engaged when I was 19 and she was 18. We had known each other since we were 10. We were extremely fond of each other in the manner of cousins. We never at any point mistook fondness for the other thing. We endured the engagement out of a sense of obligation, to my father's memory, per her mother's wishes, to the joining of 2 rather complicated estates. And we agreed, between ourselves, when I was 23, that we should marry quietly the year I turned 30, that we should be civilized to one another, and that we should each of us be permitted certain, let us say, discretions of the heart that did not embarrass the other. We held to that arrangement for 5 years. Adela broke it. Adela fell in love, with a French chemist, in fact, in Lyon, of an extremely good family but of no rank whatsoever. He is intelligent and gentle, and entirely devoted to her, and she is, last I heard, making him a much more orderly chemist than he had previously been. She wrote me in February to release me from our agreement with her sincere apologies and her sincere blessing on my own, what she described as my own, long-deferred matter. She had, you understand, suspected for some time that I had a long-deferred matter. She had been kind enough not to ask. "You were going to marry her regardless?" I was. Even though, yes. I had given my word at 19. I had every intention of keeping it. I would have made her a serviceable husband, and she would have made me a serviceable wife, and we would have been kind to each other, and our houses would have run, and I would have carried in a pocketbook a small dried cherry blossom for the rest of my life, and never said so to anyone, including myself, in plain terms. Adela was, far braver than I. She was the one who broke it. I should not have. Iris walked. The Serpentine to her left ran low and brown with the spring rains. A swan paced them on the water for 100 yards, and then thought better of it and turned back. Halloway carried her parcel. Halloway? Yes. What if Adela had not broken it? Then I should have married her, and I should have made her a serviceable husband, and you would have continued to make beautiful botanical maps and to walk in your father's gardens. And I should, once a season, perhaps, in a private hour, have looked at the cherry blossom in the pocketbook and put it away again. That is what would have happened. It is a very honest answer. You requested honesty as your first condition. I did. I shall not pretend the absence of dishonor to you, Iris. I had it. I would have kept it. I would have been the worse for it. I am not the worse for it now. She did not, for some 20 paces, reply. The Serpentine ended. They came up onto the long path that led toward the Carrington side of the park. The Vance cousins were probably, at this moment, in a club somewhere off St. James's, telling each other a great many things. And the things they were telling each other were going to turn into things being said in drawing rooms in 2 days. And in 3 days, into things half the ton would suppose to be true. She would deal with that. She would deal with that. The arithmetic of her courtship, which had begun on the dance floor at Halford's, was going to require every ounce of her composure for 3 months at the very least, and she was not, at this moment, troubled by that. Halloway, she said. Yes, Iris? You may call me Iris. He did not break stride. He did not look down at her. The line of his jaw moved, very slightly, in the small, unmistakable way he had moved it once before, in her father's drawing room, at the word love. Iris, he said. Yes. Thank you. That was all. They walked the rest of the path in silence. He left her at her father's door. He bowed. He gave her back her parcel, not, this time, with a precision of presentation, but with the small, ungrand directness of a man returning a thing that belonged to her. And he turned. And he walked away in the direction of his hotel, in his country boots, on a London afternoon in spring. And Iris stood in the doorway and watched him as far as the street corner, which she had not done for any man in her life. The Vances' first significant strike came at Lady Halford's tea on the Tuesday after. Lady Halford's tea was a very specific institution, small, dense, and almost entirely composed of the women whose opinions travelled. Lady Halford herself was an old friend of Iris's mother, and had been a quiet ally throughout the past 2 seasons. Lady Halford served Bohea, Souchong, and the most uncompromising moral arithmetic in London. There were, by Iris's count, 11 women in the room. 3 of them were Vance connections. Lady Marguerite was not among them. Marguerite was, today, conspicuously absent, which meant Marguerite had sent her field artillery in her stead. Mrs. Pelham, a Vance second cousin by marriage, broad-faced, beautiful in the cool, blank way of well-fed cattle, opened her mouth at the precise moment the second course of cakes arrived, and spoke loudly enough for the room. Lady Iris, we were so very surprised, were we not, Cordelia, by your dance at Halford's the other evening, with the Duke of Halloway. So unexpected. Were you, Mrs. Pelham? Quite. Of course we wish you every possible, but one cannot help wondering whether His Grace, having so very recently been free of one engagement, might not be very advised in the choice of his second. Across the room, Iris's mother, the Countess of Carrington, set down her cup with the soft, small click that meant that the Countess of Carrington had registered combat. Iris, for her part, did not set down her cup. She held it. She counted 3. She lifted it, drank a measured sip, returned it to its saucer with the precision Lady Halford's tea required. And then she looked across the room at Mrs. Pelham, directly, without smile, without animus, with the patient, steady attention she would give to a horse considering whether to bolt. Mrs. Pelham, she said, forgive me. I do not understand the question. Oh, my dear, it was not a question, it was... It was certainly a question. You wondered whether His Grace was very advised. The verb was wonder. The verb was directed at me. I take it as a question. Will you tell me whom precisely you propose he ought to ask, in order to be very advised, since I take it you do not propose he ask me? The room was now perfectly silent. Lady Halford, by the window, lifted her tea to her mouth with an expression of deep, decorous scholarship. My dear, Or perhaps you propose he ask the cousin, who has been informing London since Christmas that no man would cross a ballroom for me, and who has now been demonstrated, factually, in front of 140 people, to have been mistaken. Is it Mr. Edmund Vance you would have him consult? Lady Iris, Because if it is Mr. Edmund Vance you would have him consult, I should be obliged to you, Mrs. Pelham, for the introduction, since I have been wishing for some weeks to make Mr. Edmund Vance's acquaintance, for closely related reasons. Lady Iris. Yes? You misunderstand. I meant only, Mrs. Pelham. I do not misunderstand. I have spent the larger part of 2 seasons being told, in voices quite like the one you have just used, but I am not entirely what a duke would cross a ballroom for. A duke has now crossed a ballroom for me. We have all of us seen it. I do not require any of you to congratulate me. I do require all of you to remember it. She set down her cup. The silence held. Lady Halford, by the window, said into it, with the soft, beautiful precision of a woman who had been waiting half her life for the right moment. More tea, Mrs. Pelham? Mrs. Pelham did not, as it happened, want any more tea. Mrs. Pelham, over the next half hour, found that her conversation with the women on either side of her was inexplicably stiff, that the cakes near her plate were the wrong cakes, and that Lady Halford's footman seemed to forget her cup with a frequency that bordered on the artistic. 2 other Vance connections in the room rapidly remembered prior engagements. One of them, the youngest, did not so much remember as flee. By the end of the hour, the Vance interest in Lady Halford's drawing room had been reduced to one very tired Mrs. Pelham and a quantity of unread cards. When Iris reached her carriage at the end of the visit, Lady Halford herself walked her down. They paused at the carriage step. Lady Halford had been her mother's friend for 40 years, and Iris's quiet ally for 3. Lady Halford was not a sentimental woman, and Lady Halford did not, as a rule, touch other women in public. She touched Iris's wrist now, very briefly. My dear, Lady Halford said, that was a piece of work. Was it? It was, Iris. You may consider Mrs. Pelham, and in due course her cousins, instructed. Lady Halford. My dear. Will it hold? Lady Halford considered. Lady Halford had been considering social arithmetic for 40 years. It will hold for 10 days, she said. Perhaps 2 weeks. Edmund will not yield. He cannot afford to yield. He has been the loud Vance for some years now, and there are several lesser cousins who depend on his influence. If his influence collapses, theirs collapses too. He will counter. You should expect him to counter at a public event. You should be prepared for him to attempt to be... Insulting is the wrong word. Theatrical, in a setting of the ton's choosing, rather than yours. At a ball. At a ball, very likely. He is a man who likes a stage. Halloway is giving a garden party at Halloway in 18 days. Lady Halford, unexpectedly, smiled. Her smile was a thin, satisfied, almost sly thing. The smile of a woman who had played whist for 40 years. My dear, she said. Then he will go to Halloway. He will insist on being invited. He will misconduct himself there in a setting of Halloway's choosing, not his own. I shall not tell you how to fight that engagement, Iris. I shall only tell you that it is the engagement to fight. She stepped back. She inclined her head. She let the footman hand Iris into the carriage. As the door closed, Iris saw, she would remember it for a long time, Lady Halford lifting her own face, briefly, to the spring sky, in the small, private gesture of a woman who had not, after all, lost her relish for these things. She did not see Halloway for 2 days, because he had gone down to Halloway to oversee preparations for the garden party, and the preparations included, Iris's father informed her, with a dry little flick of the eyebrow, the prompt and visible appointment of a Mr. Crown to manage the household's most public affairs through the season. Mr. Crown being a younger second son of an excellent family with an excellent record of discretion, and Mr. Crown having, prior to this, managed the public affairs of Lady Adela Vance in Paris. The Earl of Clarendon had received this information from a letter sent that morning from Halloway. The Earl of Clarendon, on receiving it, had laughed once aloud, which he never did in the morning before coffee, and said, "He is taking advice." "Whose advice?" "Adela's, I should think. He has written to her in Lyon. She has answered. Mr. Crown is a deliberate signal, to the Vance interest, to the ton, to Mr. Edmund Vance, and to ourselves, that Lady Adela personally approves of her former intended's present arrangements. He has, in effect, walked Adela down the steps of his house in front of all London and said, 'We are friends. I have her good wishes. Cease.' He is very precise. He is, Iris, very precise." She wrote to him that afternoon. She did not send a long letter. She sent a single sheet, formally addressed, in which she thanked His Grace for his thoughtfulness in regard to Mr. Crown's appointment, and named, without comment, 3 of Mr. Edmund Vance's known clubs, 2 of his usual hours, and the names of 2 further cousins he was likely to bring to a country garden party as social cover. She signed it, Iris. His reply, by return courier, was 3 sentences. Iris, received with gratitude. The third cousin, in particular, I had not anticipated. H. Beatrice, watching her seal an answer, said, "Iris, are you running a campaign?" "Yes." "With a duke?" "With a duke? For yourself?" "Largely for myself, yes, Beatrice. To a small extent, also for him. He has been alone on this for 2 years. He is running it badly. He is too attentive. He is too gentle. He is the wrong commander for this engagement. I am the right commander. He has, very wisely, recognized this." Iris. "Yes, Beatrice. I should like to be Edmund's downfall. You're 19. I am 19, and I am enormous in society's blind spot, Iris. I am a girl with a spaniel and a pretty face and a reputation for talking too much. I am, at this moment, the most strategically valuable person you have in London. You could send me into Edmund's club. You could send me into anywhere. No one would think to lie carefully in front of me." Iris paused. She set down the seal. She regarded her sister, who at the age of 19 had, evidently, just understood a thing about herself that some women never understood at all. "Beatrice." "Yes?" "Find me a tea where Mr. Edmund Vance's mother is pouring." "I shall." "Take mustard. The spaniel will be invaluable." Beatrice, for a moment, was so flooded with the joy of being given a real assignment that she almost cried. She compressed the impulse into a deeply theatrical bow and left the room with the spaniel in her arms. Iris finished her letter to Halloway. The third condition of her courtship was being met with an almost unnatural fidelity. She added a postscript. "I have placed my sister into the field. She will produce intelligence within the week. You will not find it surprising. The Vance interest does not yet know what it has on its hands in 19-year-old girls, and you will be obliged to thank her in person. She will request a small dog of you in compensation. Refuse only at your peril, Iris." She sealed it, and the seal was not the Clarendon seal, but a small, plain paper one. The Clarendon seal was for state. This was a different correspondence. Beatrice came back from her infiltration of Mrs. Vance's Wednesday tea with her bonnet on slightly crooked, her cheeks the deliberate pink of a girl who had spent 2 hours pretending to be enthusiastically vacant in front of women who underestimated her, and a small, carefully composed sheet of notes folded under the lining of her glove. She came directly into Iris's library. She did not put down the spaniel. She sat on the window seat, allowed Mustard to leap into her lap, removed the glove with the air of a courier producing a dispatch, and laid the folded sheet on the table between them. Iris, I have been brilliant. Tell me. He was at his mother's. He was not supposed to be. He came in at the second hour because his mother had asked him to fetch a book from her writing room, and he stayed because there was cake. He is, Iris, very fond of cake. There are 4 observations. May I have them in order? You may. Beatrice unfolded her sheet of notes. She did not need to read from it. She had memorized everything on the carriage ride home, and was using the sheet as a stage prop for her own pleasure. She smoothed it once against the table. First, he owes Wattiers. Not the 300, which the uncle covered. Another 400, since February. The waiters know. 2 of his cousins know. His mother does not. She paused for the small, precise emphasis she had learned this winter from watching Lady Halford pour tea. Mustard, sensing a recital, settled deeper into her lap. Second, he has been writing, under his own name, Iris, the fool, to the Morning Post, under the description, a friend of the Vance interest. There have been 3 letters since Christmas. They were edited before printing because the editor is the cousin of a cousin, and the editor is not a fool. The originals are in his mother's writing desk, because he gave them to her to keep, as he gives all his cleverness to her to keep, because he is, you understand, 29 years old, and lives a very long way inside his mother's house. The light on the long table had begun to slant. Iris, listening, had not moved her hand from the pen, but had stopped pretending to write. Third, he has a friend, a Mr. Aubrey Pelham. Different Pelham, Iris, the one out of Hampshire, who has lately been asking several mutual acquaintances how, exactly, one separates oneself from a Vance interest in town, when one's own affairs are no longer flourishing. I think Edmund's bench is thinning. A small, triumphant pause. Beatrice was, for the first time in her life, enjoying being the bearer of useful intelligence, and not merely the bearer of an opinion. Iris waited. The Count moved, almost involuntarily, in the back of her mind, and she set it aside. Fourth, and Iris, you will be pleased, Lady Adela has written to Mrs. Vance directly, from Lyon. The letter arrived at the tea while I was in the room. Mrs. Vance opened it at the table, and read it once silently, and then once aloud, because Mrs. Vance is, at heart, a theatrical woman. The letter is a polite inquiry after the family's health, mentions the chemist, mentions Halloway most warmly, regrets that her cousin Edmund has been so very busy with, Adela's word, amusements, and concludes by hoping the family will, for its own sake, encourage him into a profession before the autumn. It is, Iris, the most beautifully precise letter I have ever heard read aloud at a tea, and the mother, on the second reading, did not seem to know whether to be charmed or to throw a cake. Iris had not moved. She had a pen in her hand. She set it down. She looked, for a long moment, at her sister who was 19, and who had a spaniel under one arm and a peacock blue bow at her throat, and who had just produced 4 useful intelligences of which a man in Whitehall would have been proud. And she said, very gently, Beatrice, you have the makings of an unprincipled diplomatic asset, and I shall recommend you to the Duke this evening. Iris, I should like to be paid in spaniel. You shall be paid in spaniel. He has by now perhaps 3. We shall ask for one of the puppies. He has spaniels? Mrs. Greaves said so. She mentioned them with the air of a woman whose floors have suffered. Iris, I love this man. He has cherries and spaniels, and a sister-in-law who knows when to bring cake. He is not yet your brother-in-law. He shall be. He shall be. Now, mustard off the table. We have a letter to write. She wrote the letter to Halloway that night. She enclosed Beatrice's intelligence verbatim, with a small editorial note from herself. She added the third name Beatrice had not yet caught, a Mr. Stillwell of the city, who acted as Edmund's runner at Wattiers, which she had received that morning from an entirely different source, namely, her mother's lady's maid, who had grown up in Stillwell's mother's village. She added one further line of her own, in the lower corner, in a smaller hand. Theo. We shall, I think, have him. I. The reply, by morning courier, contained only a single line. Iris, we shall. Do not, when we have him, be sorry for him. H. She read it twice. She did not show it to Beatrice. She put it instead in the drawer of her writing desk, beneath the Volksgarten map's pencil draft she still kept there, and locked the drawer. Holloway sat on the high green platform of the Welsh border country, a day's ride west of Oxford, 15 miles east of the Severn, where the home wood ran up the long ridge to the marches, and the gardens fell away in 3 terraces toward the river. The river was, this April, full and brown with the thaw, and audible from the upper terrace as a low, constant note. The garden party was set for the 2nd Saturday in May. Clarendon House was to come down on the Thursday before. Iris, Beatrice, Mustard, the Earl, the Countess, and a second cousin nobody much regarded, but who counted as chaperonage. The party would be 120 people. The Vances had, with admirable theatrical instinct, requested invitations within 2 days of the engagement of Mr. Crown, and Holloway had, with equally admirable theatrical instinct, granted them. The Clarendon party arrived at 4 on the Thursday. Holloway met them in the courtyard. He handed Iris from the carriage with the precise, slightly excessive care of a man who had been rehearsing, in a private hour, the exact economy with which he intended to greet her in front of his staff. And his staff, lined respectfully along the colonnade, observed the greeting and did not comment. And his housekeeper, Mrs. Greaves, a stout woman of 50 with a face like a closed book, observed it twice, decided it was satisfactory, and was bundled directly off by Beatrice and Mustard to discuss the spaniel's lodging. The east garden, when Holloway took her down through it the next morning, was full of cherry trees in blossom. She stopped on the lower path. He did not push her. He let her stand. The blossom was at the height of its falling, a faint pink snowfall, not yet exhausted, drifting across the grass and across her shoulders, and across the line of his coat. The smell was the smell of garden mud and rain, which was the smell of Vienna, which was the smell of every spring she had ever known. Above them, a small bird worked a bough. Holloway. Yes. Did you plant these? My grandfather planted them, Iris. He brought the cuttings from Vienna in 1788. He had an Austrian wife. She missed her mother's garden. He gave her this. The tree at the end is the original cutting. It is 60 years old. It still flowers. She stood. The blossom fell. The smell. Wet stone, fresh mud, the soft, warm green of new grass, pressed against her throat. A petal touched the bare skin above her glove and stuck there for a heartbeat with the small, cool damp of dew. Somewhere below the wall, the river ran, a steady, low whisper. The wind on her face was warm. The shadow under the cherries was cold. The small ridge of cobble under her shoe was rough through the thin sole. You did not tell me, she said, that you grew up under cherry blossom. I did not, Iris, want to overplay my hand. She turned her face slightly toward him. He was watching her with the patient, steady attention with which he had crossed Lady Halford's ballroom and stood in her library and laid the small, dark green pocketbook on Mr. Linwood's counter. The faint pink fell. She put up a hand and caught a single blossom in her palm, and held it, and looked at it, and looked again at him. She was 26, and had counted before every important act of her life since she was 8, and the Count was, at this moment, entirely silent. Holloway. Theo. Theo, she said, almost soundlessly. It was a very good hand. You should have played it. I am playing it now. Yes. She closed her fingers around the blossom. She did not put it in her pocket. She put it instead in the small pearl-edged purse on her wrist, the same purse she had worn at the embassy reception in Vienna 2 springs before. The purse she had kept folded in tissue at the bottom of her London linens, for the eventuality, never voiced, of needing it. You are. So am I. He did not answer. He gave her his arm. They walked the rest of the Cherry Avenue together at a slow pace, and Beatrice and Mustard, somewhere behind, were making delighted noises in the lower garden, and the river ran on, full and brown, 15 feet below the wall. The garden party itself was the next afternoon. The Vances arrived in 2 carriages. Mr. Edmund Vance arrived in the second. He handed his mother out of the first. He handed his mother across the lawn to the orchestra tent. He installed himself at the precise position from which he could be observed by the largest number of people, while himself observing the staircase descending from the upper terrace. And he set about, with the patient calculation of a man who had arrived at a public event for a single purpose, doing nothing remarkable, attentively, until the moment to do something remarkable arrived. The moment came at 6. Mr. Edmund Vance was, like all the Vances, beautiful. He was 29, fair, with the long jaw and faintly mocking eye of the Vance line. His coat was a beautifully cut peacock blue. His cravat was tied in the new fashion. He was charming when he wished to be charming. He was, this afternoon, not charming. He was theatrical. He stationed himself, with 3 of his cousins, near the punch table at the moment Iris and Halloway came down the stairs from the upper terrace. He timed his remark for the gap in the orchestra. He raised his voice, on the very last of the orchestra's diminuendo, to a pitch that carried. "My dear," he said to the cousin nearest him, with the accent of a man who did not at all care who heard. "My dear, do you know, Halloway is planting a new avenue of cherries in the East Garden, to match the old one. It is ever so charming. He is quite committed, is he not, to the picturesque? I am told, he travelled 3 duchies to fetch the seed." A laugh from his cousins, short, sharp, calculated to be heard. "One does wonder," said Mr. Edmund Vance, louder, "what he travelled 3 duchies for, before." The orchestra started up again. The remark hung. Several heads in the general vicinity had turned. Iris's hand on Halloway's arm did not tighten. Halloway's arm, beneath her hand, had gone briefly the precise, calm rigidity of a man whose temper was, ordinarily, considerable, and who was, at this moment, holding it under instruction. He did not move. He did not, by sound or breath, react. He waited. Iris counted, very quickly. 1, 2, 3. She let go of his arm. "Mr. Vance," she said, in a voice she had spent 2 seasons perfecting, clear, unraised, addressed to a specific man across the 10 yards of green lawn, and audible to every person between them. "I do not believe we have been introduced. I am Lady Iris Carrington. Will you walk with me a moment?" There was an instant in which Mr. Edmund Vance did the small, involuntary motion of the throat, which men do when an opponent they had not credited makes the first move. He recovered. He bowed. "Lady Iris." "Mr. Vance?" "It would be, walk with me." She did not give him the chance to refuse. She turned, she walked, at the unhurried pace she had walked across Lady Halford's ballroom on the night of the dance, across the lawn, toward the cherry avenue at the eastern end. He was, she could feel without turning, hesitating. He was, she could feel without turning, coming after her, because the alternative was to remain at the punch table while Lady Iris Carrington walked away from him in front of 120 people, which was not a thing his cousins could afford him to do. He came up alongside her at the entrance to the avenue. He was, at this remove, even handsomer than at distance, and he was angry, and the anger made his charm thinner. "Lady Iris," he said, with smooth recovery, "I was only—" "Mr. Vance, I have asked you to walk. Walk." He fell into step beside her. The cherry avenue swallowed them. The orchestra fell to a distant sound. The path, here, was narrow, and they were observed by everyone in the upper terrace, and overheard by no one. She did not raise her voice. She did not slow her step. She walked him, at a pace very slightly faster than was comfortable, the full length of the avenue. "Mr. Vance." "Lady Iris, you have been telling London since Christmas that no duke would cross a ballroom for me. Lady Iris, you have not, at any time in those 4 months, made my acquaintance. You have not, at any time in those 4 months, sought my acquaintance. You are not, at any time, going to be granted my acquaintance, except in the form of this conversation. Do you understand? Lady Iris, this is Mr. Vance. Listen carefully. What you have been doing for 4 months is not a flirtation with my reputation. It is a small business venture. You have leveraged my supposed undesirability, weekly, in clubs, to shore up your own position as the Vance to whom other Vances defer. I know exactly which clubs. I know exactly which cousins. I know exactly what you said at Boodle's on the 3rd of January, and what you said at Brooks's on the 29th. I know the names of the 4 men who repeated you, the names of their wives, and the names of the dressmakers their wives gossip with. My sister is 19 years old, and has spent the last 17 days at teas. I have a complete map. He was silent. His charm had, in the way of charm, when surprised, gone entirely. In its place was the long Vance jaw and the thinning Vance mouth. You are going, she said, to do 3 things for me, Mr. Vance. Lady Iris, you are going, this evening, before you leave Holloway, to greet me publicly on the upper terrace and to compliment me, at audible range, in front of the orchestra, on the Cherry Avenue. You will say it is the most beautiful thing you have seen in years, and that the Duke is to be congratulated on his forthcoming arrangement. You will not be clever. You will be plain. You will mean it sufficiently that those who hear you will be persuaded that the matter is settled. Do you understand? He inhaled. He did not answer. Second, she said, you are going, within the week, to pay calls upon Mrs. Pelham, and upon your mother, and upon 2 other cousins I shall name to you in writing. And you are going to inform them, in your own words, that the engagement of Holloway and Lady Iris Carrington is a matter of some private history, that you yourself have been ill-informed in the past, and that you have the highest regard for both parties. You will accept no question. You will brook no contradiction. You will end the conversation if pressed. Do you understand? Lady Iris, you cannot. Third. She stopped walking. They had reached the end of the avenue. The river ran below the wall, full and brown. She turned, in the dappled spring shadow under the last cherry, and faced him precisely, and did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him, as one looks at a horse that one has decided is one's horse. Third, Mr. Vance, you will, in the next 30 days, find a sufficient reason to take your interests to the country for the season. Wales would be acceptable. So would Yorkshire. I am told there is excellent fishing in both. Lady Iris, I shall not be. You will. You will, because the alternative is that I write, by tomorrow's mail, 3 letters. The first to your mother, naming the 4 men, the Boodle's date, the Brooks's date, and one further matter, relating to a draft of £300 you wrote at Wattier's in February, which was honoured only because of a private indulgence by your uncle's banker. Your mother does not know about the indulgence. Your mother has, as you are aware, a very strict view of indulgences. His face moved. The second letter is to your uncle, who funded the indulgence. He does not yet know that you cited him by name in a story you told at White's in the same week. I have the precise wording of the story. It is very flattering to you. It is not flattering to him. You. The third letter, Mr. Vance, is to Lady Adela in Lyon. She has, by her own letter to Holloway in February, expressed an opinion of you which she has so far shared with only the Duke and her French chemist. I shall ask her permission to share it more widely. I shall not need to ask twice. She did not raise her voice. She did not require to. I shall send, she said, more quietly, none of these letters if you do, this evening, the 3 things I have asked. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long, complete moment, because he was, after all, a man who had been outmatched, and he had, in his own way, the grace to acknowledge it. He bowed. The bow was deeper than rank required. Lady Iris, he said, I shall do them. Then, Mr. Vance, I have nothing further. Please precede me back to the upper terrace. I shall follow at a distance. We shall not, you and I, walk together a second time. He He went. She watched him go. He went up the slight rise of the avenue, with the slow, deliberate pace of a man taking a punishment in front of an audience he could not yet see. And he reached the top, and he walked across the lawn to the upper terrace, and he found his cousins, and he did not stay with them. He went, instead, to the orchestra tent end of the terrace, where Halloway was standing in unobtrusive conversation with Lord Halford, and he said, audibly, in a tone that was, for a Vance, astonishing in its lack of irony, "Halloway, the Cherry Avenue is the most beautiful thing I have seen in years. You are to be congratulated on your forthcoming arrangement." Halloway, with the precise, unrushed courtesy he had used in her father's drawing room, inclined his head exactly 1 inch. "I am obliged to you, Mr. Vance." "You are not." "I am, sir. Obliged to you all the same." A space of silence on the terrace. The orchestra's lower notes moving into the new piece. Mr. Edmund Vance stepped back. He bowed again. He left, with his cousins, in their 2 carriages, before the supper bell, which was not according to plan, but was, by the small subterranean current of comment that immediately ran through the assembled company, interpreted exactly as it had been arranged to be interpreted, that the matter was settled, that the Vance interest had withdrawn its objection, and that the host of the afternoon was, very visibly, the host of the season. When Iris reached the upper terrace, having walked back from the Cherry Avenue at the slow pace she had set for herself, Halloway was waiting for her at the top of the stair. He did not speak. He took her hand. He turned it, very briefly, palm upward, and he pressed his thumb once across the inside of her wrist, a small, private greeting that was visible to no one but her, and he said, quietly enough for her ear alone, "Iris, you are extraordinary." "I am efficient." "You are extraordinary." "Theo." "Yes." "You will tell me, later this evening, what he said when he walked up to you on the terrace." "He said that Cherry Avenue was the most beautiful thing he had seen in years." "He did not." "Iris, he did, verbatim. He looked, when he said it, like a man eating his own boot. I've not had so much pleasure at a garden party in my life." "Theo." "Yes." "Walk me into supper." "Madam, gladly." In the hour before supper, when the light on the upper terrace had gone the dense gold that came at Halloway only on May evenings, the orchestra had paused, and Halloway, with the small, unhurried economy he used for everything, came across the lawn to where Iris was standing at the parapet of the lower wall and stopped 1 pace behind her shoulder. He did not speak. He waited. She did not turn. She set her hands, palm flat, on the cool stone of the parapet, and she looked down at the river, at the long brown current, the line of last winter's reeds against the bank, the small sudden disturbance where a fish had risen to a fly and gone down again. And she counted. Once. Deliberately. Because she chose to. "Iris," he said. "Theo." "Will you walk with me to the river path?" "In a moment. Stand here a moment." He stood. He set his own hand on the parapet, 2 inches from hers, not touching. The line of his sleeve, where it met the cuff of his coat, was warm even at this remove. She felt it through the linen of her own sleeve before any contact occurred. The smell of garden mud was strong below the wall. A gull, far off, made the small, high cry gulls made over rivers in spring, and was answered by another gull. She set her smallest finger across the small distance and laid it, for 1 quiet beat, on the side of his hand. He did not move. He did not lift the hand. He merely allowed his hand, after a moment, to turn. Slowly. A slow, private rotation against the stone, until it was palm up under her finger. And then her finger, of its own accord, slid into the palm. And then his fingers, of their own accord, closed once around hers, lightly, as they had closed at the first dance, and then opened again, and she withdrew her finger. It was the work of perhaps 4 seconds. No one on the terrace, observing them, would have seen anything beyond two figures, standing at a parapet looking at a river. The gardener crossing the lower lawn with a basket would have seen even less. They were, themselves, perfectly aware of every separate motion. Iris. Yes? I have not, in 2 years, dared to do that. I am aware. It was more than I had supposed. Yes. She turned then. She did not step away from the parapet. She only turned, the smallest quarter, so that her shoulder met the warm side of his coat. He did not put an arm around her. He did not, with any small propriety-violating gesture, claim her in front of the upper terrace. He simply allowed his shoulder to take the weight of hers. 3 pounds, perhaps, of a woman leaning, briefly, against the wool of a man's evening coat, and held himself very still under it. She felt the slow, long inhale he took. She felt, beneath the wool, the warmth of him. She felt, distantly, the thud of his heart, which was not slower than it should have been, and was not faster, and was, she counted, against her will, the steady, measured count of a man who had decided some time ago to govern the pace of his own happiness.
Theo?
Yes? You are extremely warm. Iris, I have been on a sunlit terrace for an hour, and the coat is wool. I should be. That is not what I meant. I know. Theo? Yes. I have been told, by women who have made it their business to inform me, that one does not lean against gentlemen one is courting in front of the upper terrace at one's own engagement arrangement garden parties. I am aware of the rule. I propose we ignore the rule for one further beat. Iris, he said, very quietly. Lean as long as you wish. She leaned. The river ran. The gulls cried again. Somewhere across the lawn, Beatrice had captured the spaniel and was being applauded, in the old comic register, by a small clutch of cousins. Mrs. Greaves was, from the upper colonnade, observing the parapet with an expression of professional approval, and would say nothing whatever about it later. Ever. The supper bell, when it rang exactly 5 minutes later than it had been intended to ring. The housekeeper had instructed the steward to delay it by precisely that quantity, having, by the evidence of her own eyes, judged it necessary. Iris straightened. She set her hands on the parapet again. She did not look at him. She looked, instead, at the river. Theo. Yes? I shall, after supper, walk down the lower terrace, alone, toward the river. I shall, after supper, follow you down it. Yes. Iris. Yes. I shall come at a respectable distance. You shall. And I shall, when I overtake you, walk beside you as far as the dark. You shall. That was the agreement. They went in to supper. Halloway placed her on his right, Lady Halford on his left, with the small, approving smile of a woman who had not yet, even at her age, lost interest in seating arrangements. The supper ran 2 hours. Mr. Edmund Vance was not at it. Mr. Edmund Vance had, by then, been, in social terms, satisfactorily eaten. In the small interval between supper's end and the last carriage's leaving, Iris stood for a quarter hour at the open window of her dressing room. The air on her skin was cool, almost sharp, with the river smell rising from below the wall. Wet stone, fresh mud, the bittersweet pressure of cherry sap. The fire in the grate had burned down to copper coals. The silk of her undressed sleeve brushed the cold of the iron casement. She felt it on the back of her hand, then on the inside of her wrist, then along the soft skin of her throat, where she had unfastened the top loop of her gown. Her pulse, when she set 2 fingers to it, ran slightly fast. She did not bring it down. She wanted, tonight, to feel her own pulse with the precision the Count had always trained her not to feel. Outside, the cherry blossom drifted in soft, slow whispers across the gravel, and the wind that moved them was warm. For the first time this season, warm, and tasted, faintly, of the new green of the wood. That night, after supper, long after supper, after the orchestra had finished and the last carriage had pulled away, and Beatrice had been firmly removed to bed by the Countess, and Mustard had been firmly removed to the kitchen by Mrs. Greaves, who had developed strong views, Iris walked alone down the long lower terrace toward the river. The night was warm. The cherry blossom, by lamplight, was a faint suggestion of paleness against the black wall of the wood. The river below ran full and steady. She had counted all evening, the way she had counted at the Halford ball, and the Count had, at supper, when he had set his palm flat on the back of her chair as he passed behind her seat, slipped briefly. It had not yet returned. She heard him on the gravel before she saw him. He came up beside her without speaking. He did not offer his arm. They walked, at a slow, steady pace, the length of the lower terrace and out onto the path along the river, where there were no lamps. The dark was complete. The river was a steady noise and a faint shine. The cherry blossom, here, fell in the dark with a small, soundless rustle on the path. He stopped. She stopped. "Iris," he said. "Yes." "I did not, today, get to do the thing I had thought of doing today." "What had you thought of doing today?" He was silent. He was, she could feel without seeing, choosing his words with the precision he had used about Lady Adela on the path beside the Serpentine. He took, instead of speaking, her hand. He turned it. He pressed his palm to hers, not laced, just flat, and held it. "I had thought," he said, "of telling you." "Of telling me what?" "Of telling you that I have loved you for 2 springs." She did not answer at once. She looked, instead, at the dark indication of the river below them, and she felt the warmth of his palm against the cool of hers, and she counted, once, and then stopped, because the count had no purpose here. The smell of garden mud rose, slow, with the warmth that came up off the stone wall after a sunlit day. The faint sound of a small wind moved through the cherries above. A loose petal touched the back of her wrist with the slight, wet cold of dew, and slid, and was gone. Her own breath was steady. His was not, quite. She had the small, sharp shiver in it before he steadied. The silver buttons of his coat were cold against the soft skin of her thumb where it had come, of itself, to rest at the open of his lapel. "Theo." "Yes?" "You are telling me now." "I find I am." "Then I shall tell you," she said, and her voice was the voice she had used to her sister at the Halford ball, the patient, calm voice. "That I have loved you since the morning of the 7th of April 2 years ago, in the Volksgarten, when you asked me about the cherry trees, and did not lie to me about why you wished to know." He inhaled, sharply, just once. The way a man inhales was being struck. "Iris." "Yes." "I had not been certain." "You should have been. I broke the blossom from the branch." "I was, for a long time, too disciplined a man to allow myself to be certain." "You are no longer." "I am no longer." He did not pull her against him. He did not, with the small, grand sweep that other men would have made of it, kiss her. He turned her hand over again, and lifted it, and pressed his mouth, with grave, perfect courtesy, once to the inside of her wrist where her pulse moved. He held her hand there a beat. He let it down. He did not let it go. "Iris." "Yes." "I should like, in due course, to ask your father something." "I am aware." "I shall ask him on the Monday after we return to London." "That would be agreeable." "Iris." "Yes." "Will you tell me your 3 conditions for marriage?" "They are different from the courtship conditions." "I expected so." "Theo?" "Yes." "They are that you will keep my map of the Homewood in your study, where you have kept the Volksgarten map. That you will not, when in our houses, behave as a duke. That you will plant, in our 2nd year, a cherry tree in the East Garden in my name, and that on the day you plant it, you will not plant it alone." He did not speak for a moment. The river ran. The blossom fell. "Iris," he said very quietly. "Granted, granted, and granted." He kissed her then, only once, in the dark. And the kiss was not the kiss of a man who had crossed a ballroom. It was the kiss of a man who had, in fact, finally arrived. His mouth was warm. His lips were soft, then firm against hers. She felt his breath shiver once before he steadied. She felt the press of his hand at the small of her back through silk, the slight rough scrape of a fingernail against the silver buttons there, the smooth pressure of his shoulder against her cheek as she leaned in. He smelled of saddle leather and clean linen and the bitter sweet of cherry sap on the night air. He held her, briefly, the way he had held her hand at the parapet at 6 o'clock, flat, exact, warm, and then released her, the way he released a thing he had a right to, but did not yet propose to claim. She felt the cold of the night where he had been. She did not flinch from the cold. She set her own warm fingers briefly to her own mouth, and held them there. The cherry blossom drifted. The river went on. Somewhere on the upper terrace, Beatrice's spaniel, who had escaped Miss Greaves's kitchen, made a small triumphant editorial sound, and was caught, and was returned, and the night closed over the lower terrace at Halloway, as quietly as a hand closing a book. The wedding, 5 months later, was in the chapel at Halloway in early October. It was very small and entirely satisfactory. The Earl gave Iris away. Beatrice, in primrose silk, wept exactly twice, at the appropriate moments, and Mustard, in a fresh ribbon of saffron, behaved with the perfect dignity of a small dog who had been bribed with cheese. Lady Adela sent flowers from Lyon, and a very long, very witty letter that Halloway read aloud at the breakfast, and that made the Countess of Clarendon laugh until she had to put down her cup. Lord Halford was there. Lady Halford was there. She sat in the second row and looked, very briefly, at Iris's face during the vows, and her own face, for one moment, did the thing it had done at the carriage step. Mr. Edmund Vance was not there. Mr. Edmund Vance was, by all accounts, fishing in Yorkshire. He was said to be very keen on the fishing. He was said by some to have taken to it like a man who had needed a rest. The East Garden at Halloway, in the second spring of their marriage, had a new cherry tree at its head. It had been planted in March, on a still afternoon between the rains, when the smell of garden mud was at its strongest, and the river, 15 feet below the wall, was running full and brown with the thaw. They had planted it together. The Duke had used the spade. Iris had held the sapling. Mrs. Greaves, watching from the upper terrace, had pronounced it satisfactory and gone in to make tea. Beatrice, who was now 21 and engaged to a very nice junior baronet from Hampshire, whom she had met, of all places, at a tea, had taken Mustard out of the way of the spade. Mustard had stolen, and was mildly proud of, a left-hand garden glove. On the first morning of true blossom, Iris walked down the lower terrace at the hour she always walked it now, 7:30, when the gardeners had not yet come. The blossom fell. The smell of garden mud and rain was in the air. She did not, this morning, count her steps across the threshold from the terrace to the lower path. She had not counted her steps for some months, except occasionally, at parties, out of fondness for the old habit. She wore a green walking dress, because she liked green. She carried a small, pearl-edged purse on her wrist. The purse was empty now of its single, dried cherry blossom, because the blossom, last summer, had been placed by her own hand in the binding of a book Thea was making for her, in her own colours, at Mr. Linwood's. She walked the avenue. The new tree, at the head, had not yet flowered, but it would. The gardener said another fortnight. He came up the path behind her. She heard him on the gravel before she saw him. He came up beside her without speaking. "Iris." "Yes, Thea." "I came as soon as I could." It was an old joke now between them. She had teased him with it on the day he had been delayed by his estate manager half a morning on her birthday last summer, and they had used it since for every minor lateness. The borrowed phrase from the line he had given her at Vauxhall on their first walk, the line that had once been a confession and was now an everyday courtesy. She turned her face up to him. He had a small piece of fallen cherry blossom on his coat. She brushed it off. She kept the blossom in her hand, briefly, and then let it go, and it fell again, and she watched it, and she watched him. Theo. Yes. You came across a ballroom for me. I did. And 3 duchies. And 3. She closed her hand over his, and they stood together at the head of the new cherry, and the river below ran on, full and brown with the spring thaw, and the cherry blossom drifted, and she did not count. If you've ever waited for someone, quietly, without drama, without making a project of the waiting, and then watched the moment arrive when you were finally allowed to walk across the room toward them, you know how this story feels in the throat. Tell me your favorite line in the comments. If it is the cherry blossom, you and I shall agree. And if you would care for another long, quiet story like this one, the bell will let you know when the next is ready by the fire.